My name is Renata. I'm 38 years old, and I watched 5 years of my life, my creation project Aegis, get handed to an intern during a sterile 10 a.m. meeting. My boss, Gavin, wouldn't even look at me when he clicked to the final slide. It was the new organizational chart. There, at the very top, was Grant Croft, the investor's son, listed as project director. My name was in a tiny box below his, labeled Technical Advisor. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, closed my laptop, and knew exactly what I had to do. Before I tell you how my single resignation triggered a logical chain reaction that brought the entire company to its knees, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever poured your soul into something only to watch someone else steal the credit, hit that subscribe button. You'll want to see what happened next. The air in the main conference room was always chilled, but that morning it felt unnervingly cold. I sat at the long, polished table, my coffee untouched, watching my boss, Gavin. He was standing at the head of the room, ostensibly leading a meeting about the final launch phase for Project Aegis, but he had been avoiding my eyes for the last 10 minutes. Gavin was normally a picture of relaxed authority, but today he was stiff, his words clipped. He kept adjusting his tie and clearing his throat as he spoke, his gaze fixed on a point just above my team's heads. As we pivot from development to commercialization, he said, and I felt the first real prickle of unease. He was using his shareholder's voice, a smooth, impersonal tone filled with corporate platitudes. We need to strategically restructure the team to better align with our business objectives and leverage the incredible assets we've built. I glanced at Kira, my lead engineer, who was sitting beside me. She caught my look and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She felt it too. My entire team, the brilliant minds I had handpicked and bled with for 5 years to build Aegis from a concept on a whiteboard into a revolutionary platform, was sitting perfectly still. They weren't just quiet, they were holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Gavin had built his career on promising that Nexus Core was a true meritocracy, a place where the work was all that mattered. I had believed him. This new phase requires agile business thinking and a strong focus on go-to-market strategy, Gavin continued, his voice wavering just slightly. He knew what he was doing was wrong. That fractional loss of control, that slight tremor in his voice, was more damning than any admission of guilt. He was a man knowingly betraying his own stated values. He finally picked up the remote for the projector. To that end, we've established a new leadership structure for Project Aegis. The click of the remote echoed in the dead, silent room. The slide changed. It was an organizational chart. My eyes snapped to the top. In a large, bold box, it read, Grant Croft, Project Director. Grant, the investor's son, an intern with an expensive degree who had been with us for 6 months and whose primary contribution was asking if we could gamify the user interface. I followed the solid line down from Grant's box. There, at the bottom, connected by a thin dotted line, was a much smaller box. Inside it was my name, Renata, followed by a new, insulting title, Senior Technical Advisor. I wasn't just demoted. I was being put on a shelf. I was being told to sit quietly and advise the very person who had just stolen my life's work, and I was expected to report directly to him. The blood didn't drain from my face. Instead, I felt a sudden sharp clarity, as if the cold air in the room had finally solidified into ice in my veins. I could hear Kira's sharp, tiny intake of breath beside me. To my left, our two senior data scientists looked like they had been turned to stone, their faces blank with disbelief and a slow dawning anger. The silence stretched, becoming heavy and suffocating. Gavin saw our reactions. He saw the color leave his star team's faces, and he faltered. He rushed to fill the silence, his words tumbling out too quickly. Grant brings a fresh business perspective from his studies, and we feel his leadership is key to capturing market share. And Renata, of course, your technical guidance will be invaluable to him and to all of us. He finally looked at me, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes, searching for my approval, for my understanding. He was hoping I would be a team player. He was hoping I would swallow my pride for the good of his budget. He was hoping I was a fool. I didn't give him the satisfaction of an outburst. I didn't cry or yell. I simply looked back at him, held his gaze, until he was forced to look away first, and I offered him a small, tight smile. And in that precise, crystalline moment, I knew exactly what was going to happen next. But to understand why what I did next wasn't an emotional outburst, but a logical conclusion, you have to understand the promise that was broken. 5 years earlier, I had walked into the Nexus Core lobby as one of the most sought-after data architects in the country. I had my pick of offers from larger, more established firms, but I chose Nexus Core, then a rising star, because of Gavin. He sat across from me in that final interview, radiating a seemingly genuine charisma. He sold me on a vision not just of a company, but of a culture. "Renata," he had said, leaning forward, "I don't care about politics. I don't care about hierarchy. I care about building revolutionary things. This place is a meritocracy. The work, and only the work, speaks for itself." I believed him. I accepted the offer. Project Aegis wasn't an assignment Gavin gave me. It was an idea born at 2 in the morning, sketched frantically on the back of a cocktail napkin after I spent 18 hours straight wrestling with a data processing bottleneck in our legacy systems. It was a solution to a problem no one else had been able to solve. When I brought the concept to Gavin, his eyes lit up with genuine excitement. He didn't water it down or send it to a committee. He gave me a dedicated budget, full autonomy, and the authority to build my own team from scratch. "This is it, Renata," he had said. "This is what will put us on the map." My first and only call was to Kira, the most brilliant and uncompromising systems engineer I had ever worked with. She was fiercely independent and despised corporate bureaucracy, but I convinced her. "This place is different, Kira," I promised her. "Gavin gets it. He's protecting us from the politics. We just get to build." And for 3 years, that promise held true. We were a fortress of pure innovation inside the larger company. We worked impossible hours, fueled by caffeine and a shared belief that we were creating something that mattered. We hit every milestone, solved every impossible challenge. I remember the night we celebrated our first successful end-to-end prototype. It was well past midnight. Gavin came down to our corner of the office with a bottle of expensive whiskey. He poured a glass for each of us, raised his, and looked directly at me. "To Renata," he toasted, his voice thick with sincerity. "This project isn't just the future of Nexus Core. You are the future of Nexus Core." That promise, that absolute belief in merit, held true right up until the day the first major round of institutional funding closed. The money was transformative. It validated everything we had worked for, and it came with attachments. Leland Croft, the chief executive officer of the investment firm, became a regular presence, and he always brought his son, Grant Croft, along. Grant was fresh out of an expensive business school, armed with an impressive degree, a perfectly tailored suit, and an air of supreme confidence that comes from never having a door closed in your face. Gavin announced at an all-hands meeting that Grant would be joining Nexus Core as a strategic intern tasked to learn the business from the ground up by observing our most innovative teams. His real job, we soon learned, was to simply be seen. At first, his presence was just a minor background irritation. He would sit in our advanced technical reviews, not taking notes, but scrolling through his phone, clearly bored. Then he would interject with questions that were so basic they derailed the entire meeting. "Why don't we just use blockchain for this?" he'd ask confidently, in the middle of a complex discussion on data latency. Or he would question our algorithm choices, not with any technical curiosity, but with the arrogance of someone who had skimmed a relevant article that morning. I remember one specific development sprint. We were deep in the weeds optimizing the core analytical engine, a delicate process that required total concentration. Grant pulled me aside, interrupting my entire team to suggest we focus on improving the user experience. His big idea, changing the color of the main dashboard buttons to a more dynamic blue. I stared at him for a full second, took a slow breath, and told him his input was noted and that we would consider it during the next design review. I then turned back to my team and we got back to the actual work. That dynamic blue incident should have been a joke we laughed about later. Instead, it became the turning point. It was the first time Gavin directly intervened. He called me into his glass-walled office later that day, closing the door, a gesture he rarely used. "Renata, I need you to be patient with Grant," Gavin said. He wasn't looking at me, but rather at the cityscape behind me. "His father is our most important partner. Leland is. Particular. We just need to make Grant feel included, help him learn, bring him up to speed." "Bring him up to speed?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Gavin, he doesn't have the foundational knowledge. He's interrupting complex architectural discussions to talk about button colors." "Just handle it, Renata," he said, his tone dismissive. "I don't care how. Just make him feel welcome. It's important." It was the first time the word partner had been used to override the word merit. It was the first time I realized the walls of our fortress were not as strong as I'd believed. Making him feel included quickly escalated. Grant started using the word "we" in update meetings. "When we solved the processing bottleneck," he'd say, referring to a problem my team, led by Kira, had spent 3 sleepless nights fixing while he was out at a client dinner. Then I noticed I was being left off the invitations for strategy calls with potential clients. When I asked Gavin about it, he brushed it off with a practiced smile. "I'm trying to free you up, Renata," he said smoothly. "I need your mind focused on the core technology, not bogged down in these repetitive business development calls. Leave the sales pitch to us." I felt the walls closing in, but I told myself the work was what mattered. The work would speak for itself. That was my second and perhaps greatest mistake. The slow-motion theft of my project crystallized on a Tuesday afternoon. I was walking back from the cafeteria, coffee in hand, and I passed the main glass conference room. Inside, I saw Gavin, 2 men in expensive suits I didn't recognize, and Grant Croft. Grant was at the front of the room, standing beside the main monitor, pointing confidently. On the screen were my slides. Not the marketing slides, but my deep dive architectural diagrams, the very intellectual property I had designed. He was presenting the core architecture of Aegis as if he had built it himself. I stood there frozen, watching him take credit for my breakthroughs, my team's sleepless nights, my algorithms. Gavin was sitting next to him, nodding encouragingly, smiling at the clients. When Grant fumbled a technical question, I saw Gavin lean in and whisper something, redirecting the conversation. That afternoon, I tried to access the central repository where we stored all client-facing presentations and the future development roadmaps. My credentials, which had administrator-level privileges, were rejected. A small red message appeared on my screen. Your access level for this directory has been changed to read only. And that brought us back to this moment. Back to this cold conference room with the insulting organizational chart glowing on the wall and the heavy, suffocating silence. Gavin was still looking at me, that desperate, pleading smile frozen on his face as he finished his speech. And Renata, of course. Your technical guidance will be invaluable to him. He was waiting for me to nod to accept my place as a footnote on my own project. He was waiting for me to be the team player and swallow this public execution with a smile. My team was watching me. I could feel their collective gaze. Kira's face was pale, her jaw set in a rigid line. She knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't just a demotion for me, it was a death sentence for the project's integrity. They were replacing the architect with an interior decorator. I looked at Grant Croft. He wasn't even trying to hide his smirk. He sat back in his chair, arms crossed, looking like a child who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom he didn't build and possessed no idea how to rule. He looked, in a word, victorious. I turned my attention back to Gavin. I let the silence hang for another 5 seconds, letting him and everyone else in that room feel the full, crushing weight of his decision. Then, very slowly, I reached down and closed my laptop. The soft click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I stood up, taking my time to smooth the front of my jacket. I picked up my phone from the table, and then I picked up my company access badge. I walked calmly, my heels clicking on the floor, to the front of the room. I passed the shocked faces of my team and stopped directly in front of Gavin, standing between him and Grant. I didn't say a word. I simply held up my access badge, letting him see it. Then I placed it on the polished table and slid it gently toward him. Gavin's eyes widened. His false smile vanished, replaced by a genuine stammering confusion. Renata, what is this? What are you doing? That, I said, my voice perfectly level and clear, loud enough for everyone to hear, is my resignation, effective immediately. I turned to Grant, who was no longer smirking. Congratulations on the promotion. Finally, I turned back to Gavin, whose face, which had been pale, was now beginning to turn a deep mottled red. The vein in his temple throbbed visibly. I hope this decision works out exactly as you expect. Renata, don't be dramatic, he hissed, his voice low and tight, finally dropping the pretense of corporate civility. This isn't the time. We can and will discuss this privately. There is nothing to discuss, Gavin, I replied, my voice still calm. You've made your position and mine perfectly clear. I turned and walked out of the conference room. I didn't look back. I could hear Gavin calling my name, his voice no longer hissing, but rising in panic. Renata, wait! Get back here! I kept walking. The long hallway to the elevator bank felt like the final stretch of a marathon I hadn't known I was running. I pressed the down button and stood there, my reflection staring back at me from the polished steel doors. I heard quick footsteps hurrying behind me. I didn't turn around. It was Kira. She stopped beside me, not saying a word. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fury and absolute respect. The elevator chimed, announcing its arrival. As the doors began to open, Kira unclipped her own access badge from her belt. She didn't try to hand it to Gavin, who was now halfway down the hall. She simply turned to the wall where the badge return slot was located, and she dropped it in. The sound of the plastic card hitting the bottom of the empty bin was definitive. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. Just as Kira followed me in, my phone, which I had switched off silent mode, vibrated in my hand. It was an email notification. Then it vibrated again, and a third time, all in rapid succession. I glanced down at the screen. They weren't messages from Gavin. They were system-generated notifications from the Human Resources portal. The two senior data scientists from my team, the ones who had been with me since the very beginning, had just submitted their resignations. They hadn't even bothered to give Gavin the courtesy of a 2-week notice, or even a conversation. They had logged into the system and terminated their employment while still sitting in that conference room. As the elevator doors began to close, I had a final clear view down the hallway. Gavin was standing frozen, his phone clutched to his ear, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The system had just realized it hadn't just lost a single employee. It had lost the entire engine. When Kira and I walked out of the lobby, the city air had never felt so crisp. I didn't look at my phone for the rest of the day. I went home, booked a flight, and the next morning I was on a plane to a place with no cellular service. For 2 solid weeks, I hiked, I slept, and I did not think about Nexus Core once. When I finally switched my phone back on, it exploded with notifications. Dozens of texts from former colleagues, missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and several panicked, increasingly desperate voicemails from Gavin. I ignored them all and called Kira. "Well," she said, her voice dry, "you missed the fire." She explained that in the days after our departure, the office had descended into chaos. Gavin, attempting to control the narrative, had announced our resignations as a planned transition. Nobody bought it. "Here's the best part," Kira continued. "They tried to fill the void. Gavin hired an external consulting firm, one of those expensive Tier 1 groups that charges a fortune just to walk in the door." I had to laugh. "And how did that go?" "They lasted exactly 1 week," she said, savoring the words. "They quit the contract, told Gavin that the architecture of Aegis was too complex, and, this is a direct quote from their exit report, deeply and inextricably personalized around my core logic." It was true. Aegis wasn't just code. It was a philosophy. I had designed it to learn and adapt in ways that broke conventional rules. The documentation, which I had meticulously maintained, was useless to anyone who didn't share the fundamental understanding of why it was built that way. The consultants had concluded that without the original architect, the project was unmanageable, and the risk of catastrophic failure was 100%. "So now," what I asked. "Now Gavin is in full-blown panic," Kira said. "I heard from someone in legal that he's been trying to get Human Resources to review our non-compete clauses. He's terrified we're going to build a new Aegis for someone else." That was exactly what I intended to do. I spent the next week taking calls, lining up interviews with Nexus Core's biggest competitors. The news of the Aegis exodus had spread through the industry like wildfire, and my value had never been higher. I was in the final stages of negotiating an offer with a rival firm when I received a call from an unlisted number. "Renata," a deep, smooth voice said. It wasn't Gavin. It was Leland Croft. "Mr. Croft," I replied, my voice cool and professional, "this is unexpected." "I'll be direct, Renata. I'm a busy man," he said, his tone accustomed to immediate obedience. Gavin mishandled the situation. He let emotion cloud a simple business transition. He was weak. I waited, saying nothing. He was attempting to build a rapport by throwing Gavin under the bus, a classic power move. He created a problem, Leland continued, a problem I now have to solve. My firm has too much capital invested to let this project die, so here is my solution. He paused for dramatic effect. I am offering you the position of Chief Technology Officer for all of Nexus Corp, effective immediately. A significant pay increase, a new equity package. You will, of course, report directly to me. It was a tempting offer, the title, the money, but I knew there was a catch. And Grant? I asked. Grant will remain in his post as project director for Aegis Leland, said, his voice hardening, devoid of any room for negotiation. The market needs to see stability. The transition has already been announced. Politically, it must stand. I let the audacity of his proposal hang in the air. He wasn't offering me a promotion. He was offering me a golden cage. He wanted me to return with a fancy new title to serve as the technical workhorse for his son to quietly fix the mess his family had created. So let me be clear, I said slowly. You want me to take on the responsibility for the entire company's technology, and I would still be subordinate to Grant on my own project? You are a very smart woman, Renata, he replied, ignoring the sarcasm. Don't be naive. This is how the world works. Everyone has a price. Name yours. I already have my price, Mr. Croft, I said. It's respect. And it's something your company and your family clearly cannot afford. I heard him draw a sharp, angry breath, but I didn't give him the chance to respond. Good luck with Project Aegis, I said. You're going to meet it. I hung up the phone. 3 months later, the entire industry gathered for the annual Innovate Tech Conference. It was the biggest event of the year, the place where new products were launched and reputations were made or broken. Nexus Corp, despite the internal chaos, had been locked into the keynote presentation slot for months. They couldn't back out without admitting catastrophic failure. I was there too. I had accepted a senior position at Nexus Corp's largest competitor, Quantum Dynamics. I wasn't presenting. I was attending as their new head of innovation, scouting the competition. The main hall was packed. The buzz was palpable. Everyone was there to see one of two things. Either the revolutionary technology Nexus Corp had been promising for years, or a spectacular train wreck. Gavin walked on stage first, looking thin and exhausted. He gave a weak introduction full of hollow corporate buzzwords, his eyes darting nervously around the crowd. Then, with a forced smile, he introduced the man of the hour, the visionary project director of Aegis, Grant Croft. Grant walked out to polite applause, wearing an expensive suit and a headset microphone, trying to look the part. He began his presentation, and it was immediately painfully clear that he was reading directly from a script he did not understand. He fumbled technical terms, mispronouncing algorithmic and heuristic. I looked at Kira, who had joined me at Quantum, and she was cringing so hard she was physically sinking into her chair. Then it was time for the live demonstration. And now, Grant said, his voice booming with false confidence, I'll show you the true power of Aegis. He typed a command into the console. On the massive screen behind him, the Aegis interface appeared. He started the demonstration, a simple query. The system icon began to spin, and spin, and spin. The query timed out. A nervous titter went through the audience. Grant's face flushed. Just a minor connection issue, he laughed nervously. The conference Wi-Fi, you know. He tried again. This time, the system didn't just time out. The screen flickered, dissolved into a cascade of error messages, and then went to a flat blue system crash screen. A total public catastrophic failure. The silence in the auditorium was deafening. Grant was frantically tapping at the keyboard, but the system was dead. During the question and answer session that followed, a prominent tech journalist known for her sharp questions stood up. "Mr. Croft," she asked, "you blamed the Wi-Fi, but that looked like a core system crash. Can you explain the error handling protocols in the Aegis architecture?" It was a simple, fundamental, technical question. Grant froze. He had no idea. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked to Gavin, who was standing in the wings, white as a sheet. Grant finally stammered, That's a highly technical question about proprietary architecture that we'll address in our next update." The journalist just nodded slowly and sat down. She had her answer. The man in charge of the project didn't understand it. I didn't stay for the rest. As I was walking out of the auditorium, I saw Leland Croft. He wasn't looking at the stage. He was standing up from his front row seat, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury, and he walked straight out of the nearest exit, leaving his son to fail alone on the world's biggest stage. The next morning, the financial news headlines were brutal. Nexus Core's Aegis fails to launch, read one. Incompetence on display, the Nexus Core meltdown, read another. The real story broke an hour later. Leland Croft's investment firm had dumped its entire stake in Nexus Core at market open, triggering a panic sell-off. The stock, which had been propped up for months on the promise of Aegis, collapsed by 90% before lunch. 6 months after that, Nexus Core was dead. The company was sold for parts. In a final, bitter irony, my new company, Quantum Dynamics, bought what was left of Nexus Core's intellectual property for pennies on the dollar, primarily to acquire the patents I had filed. Gavin was fired, of course. His name disappeared from the industry. The last I heard, he was doing some sort of low-level consulting, his reputation as a visionary completely destroyed. Grant Croft was quietly sent overseas by his father to manage a family portfolio in a different industry. 1 year to the day after that disastrous demo, I stood on the very same stage at the Innovate conference, but I was there to launch my new platform, Project Helios. We had built it at Quantum, with Kira as my chief engineer and my 2 senior data scientists running the core team. It was built on the lessons of Aegis, but it was better, faster, and stronger, free from the politics and compromises. The demo was flawless. The room was electric. My vision, the one I had sketched on a napkin years ago, was finally realized. I didn't have to plan a single act of revenge. I didn't have to make a single angry phone call. I just had to make a single logical decision. The company didn't collapse because I quit. It collapsed because it had a choice between a proven architect and an unproven intern, and it chose wrong. Have you ever had your work or ideas taken without credit? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Remember, sometimes walking away is the first step toward building something truly great.